Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to bring in Jim Lynch. It's time for Cover Your Assets here on Robin Hood Radio. Jim is an independent voice on Wall Street, the economy, sports, and other things, and that's all been accumulated by years and years and years and years of experience. Good morning, Jim. How are you? We've lost
Please hang up and try your call.
That's amazing.
You're on
Jim,
street.
how are you?
Hello.
There you are. There you are.
We are having...
It's been nothing but a morning of problems connecting with people doing our shows, Jim. It's been...
You have a problem connecting. I think you need a new plug. That's all.
Oh, yeah. Would it were that simple. I think it's Huawei. Or TikTok, something.
Well,
Okay,
anyways.
shall we just get some stamps in an envelope and mail it in, so to speak?
No,
or?
we should get two
Well,
tin
actually,
cans.
the way we connect via telephone is the best way, and I have no idea what happened when I put you on our hold, because our virtual hold, and it is a virtual hold, shows you and I can hear you in my earphone in the background, and all of a sudden, gone. But we won't worry about that. We'll just move on. You know.
Well, what happened, I moved it from one ear to the other.
That'll do
And the right ear tends to short things out. So,
Remember the Atlantic cable?
It's nice to hear your voices.
All right, Jim. What's going on in your world?
Oh, you don't want to know, do you?
No.
Really? Are you in the same world I am? Or,
I think
or have you risen above it?
I think I'm in a portion of your world, definitely.
Yes. Well, the sun is out. It's a little cloudy out there. Now, anyhow, seriously, what else can you do but being serious, right? Even though more of folks I see on the Facebook or whatever are really going out of their way to create some laughs, which is really appreciated. Anyhow, let's start with a couple of good things. The Supreme Court has basically stopped the Dakota pipeline, which has been fought over for 4 years. This is a pipeline that goes under the sacred ground of the Indians, and also is involved in their water situation. In other words, if there's a leak, it would really hurt the water. Secondly, from the news, the Supreme Court now says that those people who are what we call the electors, when we all vote in a state, and they count the votes up and so forth, there is this group called electors in each state, and they are the ones who have to cast a yes or no in terms of the vote. If it was for one candidate, they can say yes or maybe no. Well, they can't do that anymore, according to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, those are faithless. They're called faithless voters. When the electorate votes and then the delegates get together, they are meant to follow what the vote is. But when they decide to go their own route, they're called faithless voters. And this has become a concern because in the last election, I think there were 12 or 15 voters that voted contrary.
Usually it's one or...
Yeah.
There's been one or two in the past.
No, it's not necessarily. I don't necessarily agree with the Supreme Court on this, but I do understand why the Supreme Court is worried about this. If voters want to get rid of the Electoral College, then they've got to go to each state and they have to vote. That state has to vote to get rid of the Electoral College. They get a majority of states, then they go to the House, then they go to the Senate, and then they get the president to sign it. That is, and I think that's the way the Supreme Court wants things to go. They don't want to put the cart before the horse by having people bail out of their contract abilities as being a voter for that.
I think you're exactly right, and I think the court wants to clear up the situation, and namely have your vote count and get away from this old-fashioned way of doing things. And so I see that as pretty positive from the court in attempting to right certainly the environmental problem and here the voting problem. There is a lot of conversation out there about maybe somebody trying to rig the election or prevent mail-in voting and so forth and so on. it's incumbent on all of us here in July, and we're really not running about, hopefully, on the beach, to figure out exactly how we are going to cast our vote and find out all the particulars of mail-in and where your polling place is and all of those things months ahead of time so you can prepare and be ready to do it. Now, I think our audience is probably relatively safe in terms of what they're going to do. Other parts of the nation are not. And so, therefore, if you do want to voice your concern about other parts of the nation and maybe the vote being rigged, you should write your congressman and your House person right now. Better said, construct the letter or the email or however you're going to do it now, and do it at the end of the month when they're back in the office, and hopefully we'll read it and act upon it. We got a lot of things that we can prepare for, and we have the time to think about things and prepare for it. So, something to take up your day.
You know, it's interesting that there's so many people that are worried about if there's a mail-in ballot, this and that. Folks, we have been receiving hundreds of thousands of mail-in ballots every presidential election, from people overseas, from soldiers. So mail-in balloting is not something that's brand new and not something that's tried. Does it have to be adapted a little bit? Absolutely. But during a pandemic in certain hotspot areas, it's something that's going to have to be a reality to begin with. And so people are going to have to learn that they're going to have to understand that, we've done mail-in voting for a long time. And yes, is this a little different? But yes, we'll have to adapt to it.
And I've always had this question. Do these ballots get counted afterwards, or are they just part of the...
They get counted. They're the last things that get put in.
So,
but they have to. The whole thing about absentee ballots, they have to be in by a certain date. Whereas I think now this is where people are worried about the problem. If you vote by mail it's not an absentee ballot. Rules have to be set up how they're opened, when they're opened, and things like that. So there's a lot of things that will change, but there's a lot of Jim. We've been voting by mail for a long time.
Right. Yeah. No. I've just. Hello, Jim?
I'm with you. I was waiting for you to finish your thought. Yes, we have been, and the thing is this: when you write your congressman and senator, you might want to remind them that the federal government is very pleased to take your tax return by mail. You might remind them that the federal government is very pleased to take your check and payment of taxes by mail. And somehow that seems to have worked out, even though the federal government is a huge bureaucracy. But that's been pretty effective. And the mail, and we've all been using the mail for quite some time, it's a pretty effective way of communicating on a timely basis. So I think this should be incorporated in people talking to their congressmen and fellow citizens that, we do this every day. We mail every day. What is the big deal? Just fill out the form properly. Go ahead.
No, but there also, yes, absolutely. And in the conversation, there has to be a practical awareness that sometimes, as has certainly happened to me, Marshall ended up in Albany, I think, trying to prove that he was himself to the IRS because somebody else took his tax return, I believe, or something. I can't quite remember.
I went through a three-step process that took 1 year after somebody stole my Social Security number and filed an income tax on my behalf.
Online.
Online, and the IRS
and got his refund.
The IRS stopped it when I tried to file and it took 1 full year and 3 different meetings for me to get reinstated. But
person.
But now every year the IRS sends me a personal PIN number that I have to change every year. But it's we're not as dumb as it seems when it comes to reading mail-in ballots and to finding fraud. I think people worry about what they go back to Chicago where dead people voted.
I mean, the thing
That is an isolated location. You look at our national elections, and from day one till now, and there just is no proof of massive voter fraud. There just is no proof of massive voter fraud.
right. The bigger problem is who's on the rolls, who can vote, and so forth. There is massive voter suppression.
Well, voter
across-
suppression is
is
a different
but
question, but it's part of the same plan. Yes, it is. Voter suppression is a huge problem in this country.
So, long short, it's not. As with everything, my favorite term, it's complicated.
Well, that's because you have a mind. That's the problem.
Yeah, I know. It's a bit frustrating to see. I was just thinking, has All the King's Men been my new favorite word, canceled?
Anyhow, moving right along, the news is not very bright on the pandemic front. And I think really a greater awareness, which I find lacking even in the media, because it's such a difficult mountain to climb. But the President of the United States has been derelict in his duty now for at least regarding the pandemic, at least 6-7 months, and his dereliction was not just that he was slow to get on the ball and address it for whatever personal reasons he couldn't. But it's that he has continued with great verbosity and constant chattering to downplay, which is kind of hard to do, but he manages to do it. And he says, well, this virus will disappear and only real men go without masks and et cetera, et cetera. People, you really got to get it together. And I'm talking obviously to whoever listens. I'm not trying to make this personal, but I think we all should. Let me use the we. We all should really get very serious that we have the man running the government lying to us every time he comes on the tube or in Twittering. He lies about the pandemic going simply away, and he lies about the numbers, and he lies about the availability of tests, and he lies about possibly tracing. This man practically, well, I won't use the word I use on Twitter, but he's really putting your life in danger by even uttering the words, "Don't worry about this thing." Because those who are frightened or trying to be very manly and not admit anything, he's putting them in danger because they get this gray fog of, oh, it's going to be okay. Oh, I don't have to worry. Oh, I'm young. I can run out and do this, that, and the other thing. But the point is, the guy who runs the country, who took a pledge, an oath to keep us safe, is lying to us about our own health and our own well-being. So please pencil that into whatever you're thinking in terms of voting, be it for the senator or a House person, the president. But please be mindful that if you've been accepting this thing as a hoax, if you accept the fact that it's a hoax that the national security folks have unearthed, the fact that the Russians are killing our soldiers, then you'll be very, very easily manipulated if and when somebody tries to take over the government, the country. Now, you might think that's a little bit, oh, gee, come on, will you relax? No, it's not. It's not. This is how Germany fell. Hitler was very, very clever. He looked at people's weaknesses, he saw their prejudices, and he used them to take over the government. And Mussolini, I'm not as familiar with his work, but it's somewhat similar. All dictators use the same thing. They lie, the bravado will take care of you. If you think back to Trump running for office, he said, I can take care of it. Then you fast forward to about a month or so into the pandemic this year, and he says, well, I'm not responsible. He said that. It was televised. It was before reported. I'm not responsible. So what is he in office for if he's not responsible for the well-being of human beings? And I think you folks, all of us, ought to talk more about this audacious thing rather than accepting, oh, this is the way he is. That's all. I don't mean to get on the soapbox.
Well,
it's very concerning.
The whole thing about Donald Trump and the pandemic is, and I said this from the very, very beginning, when the pandemic started, and when finally we formed a group to fight the pandemic. The President of the United States should have been there to introduce the group the first time, step back, and then every week, every day when information was released, it came from experts in the field. And if the President at that time wanted to speak to them behind the scenes and give him his feelings, that's one thing. But this is what's created the great confusion in the politicization of
That's
this.
exactly. I was just going to interject and say the problem is the pandemic, as with everything else, is politicized.
But it became politicized very quickly because the president showed up at every one of those meetings and basically tried to hush people instead of just being out on his own. And that was a big mistake that should never have been made.
But the other thing is, every time, this has been historical at this juncture since the guy arrived in office. That's just again, I would say, when historians look back in 20 years, and if they do a search for the number of news stories that began Trump, number of people who, I can't have a conversation still 3.5 years on with a family member without it just like, well, what did, really? We're almost at the end of this. It's become so focused, so I don't know if this is a word, monocular, that it's impossible. If he turns up, it becomes politicized. I'm not making a judgment about that. I'm just making a statement. And therefore, this pandemic, from the minute that it became, quote, real, unquote, has been politicized. And that has been most unhelpful, in my view, as far as the quality of information.
Well, what's funny, Jim, is that to me it hasn't become politicized amongst the candidates. It has become politicized amongst the population.
That's it.
And that's the dangerous part of social media, Jim, because social media is it's like a pandemic. I'll tell you what, Jim, it happened to me on Saturday. Somebody sent me a video of people abusing the Great Falls in Falls Village and doing dangerous things. We posted that video, and the next day the same thing happened again. Well, yesterday, the town governments of the towns that border each side of the Great Falls, the owner of the property, First Light, all got together and said, you know what, we're going to shut this area down because it's being used improperly, and we'll have to shut it down, unfortunately, for the rest of the year. But then they will come up with a plan on how to keep people from abusing the rights of going on. When a power company opens up the rights for recreation at one of their sites, they don't want hundreds and hundreds of people sitting out in a setting that can be dangerous, and then leaving trash around. So that's the power of the internet that is good, but the power of the internet that is bad, because once things are politicized on the internet, then all of a sudden you get all the bots kicking in and all the other fake people kicking in, and it really, really is not a democratic process.
And to the point of democratic process, when this had happened, Marshall and I were talking on Sunday, and I said, well, just call the president of the power company and say, this has got to stop, because that's my approach, which is why I'm not elected to public office. And
that's what they did. That's what they did. They sat down and they called the power company, and the power company came up with a plan. Oh, let's shut it down. So.
And in this case, because not just public health but public safety was involved. This wasn't somebody complaining about one person. This was, shall we say, a problem.
All right, Jim, we've left you 2.5 minutes to wrap up here.
Oh, my God. So long? I'm used to that 30-second thing, you know,
Yeah.
right at the end of the game when I got to hit a long one, so
That's
to speak.
right.
Yeah. anyhow. Oh God, you know, it'd be nice if we. I can't go there. I was going to talk about magical thinking, but that's our president. I hope you're all taking care of yourselves mentally and physically in terms of dealing with the situation. It's a crisis, and the idea to address it as a crisis, do what you have to do, and do it. Schedule yourself so that you don't meander off into worrying too much. And if you're doing everything you can, then you really have to eliminate the worry. The other thing is the physicality. You've got to be walking. You've got to be doing, depending on age and so forth, exercise in the house. You've got to get out in the yard for hours at a time, reading a book or whatever. Obviously, to each person, they do what they do. But, you know, we are beings that are very powerful, and we have minds that, if used properly, can really do a lot in terms of bringing positive things into focus. We must really do this. This could be a very long haul that we're going through. And in terms of the voting thing, we're going to eventually do all our stuff that way, so we don't have to get involved. That doesn't mean not socialize, but it means taking care of one another by doing what one another should do to take care of ourselves.
Yeah. All right. That's a good way. That's a good way.
I don't know. Let's just say some prayers. Go with God and stay healthy. I'll see you.
All right,
Bye
Jim.
bye.
Take care. Jim Lynch, and Cover Your Assets this morning here on Robin Hood Radio. You can also find him online at robinhoodradio.com. Click on demand. Click on Jim Lynch, Cover Your Assets.